Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Lilly, the Director of Content Programming at CEDA. Welcome to CEDA's live stream today, Building Resilient Australian Cities, where we're joined by leading experts to discuss the challenges and opportunities for Australia's city today and in the future. Before we start, CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. In my case today here in Melbourne, that's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. CEDA pays respects to elders past, present and emerging, supports their stated aspirations and is committed to recognition and reconciliation. On behalf of CEDA, I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our sponsor Arup today for their support of the event. And thanks to Paul Ravlich, CEO, New Zealand and Regional Manager of New South Wales for Siemens, who will facilitate today's discussion. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. CEDA's program in the second half of 2021 will continue to offer a diverse array of discussion forums, both face-to-face and virtual, to allow people from all corners of the country to participate and to inform and promote debate of critical issues. To keep abreast of the range of events and discussions on the most important issues impacting Australia's economic and social development, we encourage you to visit CEDA's website. So that's ceda.com.au, where you can register for upcoming events and recordings of past live streams and access our range of podcasts, video, interviews and blogs with leading experts. Today, as at all CEDA events, you will be able to interact with speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available to you via the link below the video on your screen. Or you can enter the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode RESILIENT, all one word, all caps. Post your own questions and vote on the questions by others. You can also join the conversation today or invite others to join on Twitter by using today's hashtags, which are hashtag resilient cities, all one word, and hashtag infrastructure. And please tag us, that's CEDA at CEDA_news. Now turning our attention to today's discussion. From fires to earthquakes and floods, rapid unplanned immigration to cyber attacks, all cities face a range of shocks and stresses, natural and human-made. In recent years, it seems the challenges have escalated as a result of factors like climate change and even political instability in some places. And then along came a global pandemic. With us today here at CEDA, we have an esteemed range of experts to talk about resilient cities in Australia. I'll hand over to Paul Ravlich, CEO, New Zealand and Regional Manager of New South Wales for Siemens, who will introduce our speakers and facilitate the discussion. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Jo, and hello everyone, and welcome to CEDA's Building Resilient Australian Cities, where we have the experts from across urban planning and built environment sectors to discuss, as we forward plan for the next century of Australia's cities, what factors we should consider to ensure our future cities enhance and protect the lives of our children, their societies and the environment. And CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land, committed to recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. But we have a great panel for you today, and I'd like now to extend a warm welcome to those joining us online and those that are leading this important discussion. We have Davina Rooney, Chief Executive Officer, Green Building Council of Australia, Ken Morrison, Chief Executive, Property Council of Australia, and Malcolm Smith, Australian Cities Leader, Arup. So the Siemens CEO of Siemens AG and President Roland Busch, he said, resilient infrastructure is not an option, it's a must. For us, resilience is not only about surviving, it's also about thriving, regardless of the challenge. And in saying that, about 8 years ago, Siemens, Arup, and the New York-based Regional Plan Association, the RPA, jointly prepared a report on resilient cities post-Hurricane Sandy. And it used it as a case study on the New York City electrical grid. Google Siemens and resilient cities, and I'm sure you'll find it. The report especially explored the role of technology in enhancing the resilience of cities and the critical infrastructure systems and enabling actions that can support a new approach to the system design and delivery. It commented that City-based residents and businesses depend on the effective and reliable operation of infrastructure systems to deliver energy, mobility, water, sanitation, shelter, information, emergency response, and other critical services. And cities need a new way of thinking about how they plan, design, build, and manage these essential infrastructures under more challenging conditions. And they believe that the principle of resilience offers such a way, and summarise the report as follows. Resilience is the ability of people, organisations, or systems to prepare for, respond, recover from, and thrive in the face of hazards. The goal is to ensure the continuity and advancement of economic prosperity, business success, environmental quality, and human well-being despite external threats. And in a globalised world, only the most resilient cities will remain economically competitive and attractive for business growth and capable of adapting to continually changing conditions. Now, the topic today is building resilient Australian cities. Population growth, urbanisation and climate change put our urban infrastructure under pressure. And as Joe mentioned, now we have adding cyber attacks and ransomware on critical infrastructure and global pandemics to that list. There was a meme doing the rounds at the beginning of COVID, which said, who is driving technology transformation in your business? A, the CEO, B, the CTO, or C, COVID-19. And I think it is fair to say that COVID-19 drove a lot of transformation of technology that probably may not have occurred. Now, technology is a key to building resilience. The use of real-time data analytics or artificial intelligence, as an example, will become crucial factors in enabling cities to thrive and grow. And with that, I would now like to throw the discussion over to our guest speakers, who will set the scene and each provide their opening comments prior to moving to the Q&A. If we could start first with you, please, Davina, and follow straight on to Ken upon your conclusion, and last but not least, Malcolm, prior to moving into the Q&A at about 1:35. So please remember to submit your questions to help shape the discussion. And over to you, Davina.
Fantastic. Well, it's a real privilege to be here today. And when we look at the trends driving sustainability, Paul's given a really great introduction about we've never seen more resilience challenges than in the time horizon. And when we look at the sustainability global megatrends, we really reflect that those are climate change, and that's both how we respond to net zero, climate resilience, and community resilience. So I think some of the things we're going to be really unpacking through this discussion today is when key events occur within our community, how we collectively respond is one of the things that change, whether that's social shocks, pandemics, or, the key bushfires. A combination of hard and soft infrastructure really wraps around that community response. And so the global megatrends that we follow very much are the sort of that climate change, circular economy, health and well-being, and which has been absolutely, fundamental and really maps all the way back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'll have some of my remarks regarding potentially the environment, because I think, in the context, we have some really broad range of speakers, some of whom are going to pick up sort of COVID-19. But I think we really need to look at, one of the greatest trends of this time, look at the challenges of climate change, and look at how we actually design our buildings, our cities, our communities, so we're actually future ready, because this is a really sort of a fundamental challenge when we go into this landscape. How do we make sure that we're designed for tomorrow? And that's a real combination of doing resilience reviews of where we are status quo today, and then setting up standards for how we build back better. So one of the things that the Green Building Council does key research of all the global frameworks on resilience and what those look like in the built environment, to try to take key trends for how we design better. And the fundamentals of that are how well are we set up for the shocks and stresses? Do our roofs need to be more resilient, designed for higher wind speeds, so that, when we have some of the key storms, or, some of the builders who I've been partnering with in homes have been saying there's a new demand for cleaner air quality in key events, and what does that look like in their new buildings? And some of them are choosing to seal those buildings tighter and put, different filters within those infrastructure. So it's a really combined approach in this context. And the thing that we really need to imagine is, what do we do in a voluntary sense? What do we do in a planning sense? But importantly, when we look at the Bushfire Royal Commission, it was, very focused on how we take some of those items and actually embed them in our building code so that we actually have embedded pathways for designing better to ensure that, Australians are as safe as secure as they possibly can be. I'm really looking forward to unpacking some of this, particularly with Malcolm, of how we take these constructs from a building to a community to a city scale, because having, really coherent strategies that are both tangible at an asset level. I need you to do this with your roof. We need to do this with your future systems, or we need to design within these parameters, and then actually scale up to what we look at, for our green and blue infrastructure so that we actually manage better in these scenarios, and then have the wrap of community infrastructure and community resilience around these things. We know that communities that are, closer, have tighter connections, are better at all kinds of crises. And we know that, whether it's a mental health crisis or across the context. So I think that this is a really important time to have this conversation. And I think one of the things that's incredibly heartening is the one thing that 2020 taught us is that resilience is a fundamental thing to plan for. I look at the World Economic Forum, I've looked at the top 10 trends, for a number of years. A lot of those have been environmentally focused, but the pandemic has also been on there, a major pandemic. And, if I had spoken to any of us before 2020, we would have said, we have hospitals, there'll eventually be a vaccine. We'll have to adapt, but it will be just okay. I think one of the things that 2020 taught us is that we're actually incredibly vulnerable. And so doing the homework to design and plan for resilience is really fundamental, because, we've discovered that all of our supply chains are very thin and efficient, which works great, but they're inherently quite vulnerable to any transition. And so the one thing we've learned out of 2020 is that, there's a need for resilience planning. And I really look forward to hearing the other speakers' discussion and seeing how we can bring that back together, because this is, a cross society, cross area issue. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Davina. Thanks, Paul. G'day, everybody. Thanks for involving me in what's a very important discussion. I pick up on Davina's comments there, and I completely agree. I think what the COVID experience has taught us is that it's expanded our understanding of the things we need to consider when we're thinking about resilience. So yes, pandemics may well have been on lists, but not very many people were giving it much focus, and that's what the last 15 months has been all about for all of our organisations and for governments and for the economy and our health systems. So it's a dramatic impact right in front of us. One of the things I think when we're having a resilience discussion is, and we're thinking about it in the terms of how that impacts Australia, one of the most urbanised countries in the world, is, well, what changes and what doesn't? And that's something for which there's no right or wrong answers, but we sort of need to have that discussion at the start of this, because there's a fundamental question: is the growth model of Australia's cities and urban areas, is that being fundamentally challenged, or to what extent has that been fundamentally challenged? How much goes back to being quite similar to the previous way that Australia evolved, our urban areas evolved, and how much actually changes quite considerably for the future? So, because if you sort of need to ask yourself those questions, because as we're thinking about how we build in resilience to the future, if you get those things quite wrong, then you start off in directions which are not appropriate for where what the future needs of our cities are. So I think there's a really big set of questions to ask there. And it's very hard to answer those questions because this thing's changing all the time. and looking to the future is very difficult to do. And normally in Australia, we would look to the Northern Hemisphere, look to Europe, look to North America, etc. But in fact, we're leading out of this experience. So they are looking to us and are trying to understand how Australia and Australian cities are emerging through this. And we are, for this next phase anyway, the model for others to follow and to learn from. So I might leave my introductory comments there, Paul, and happy to return to those and other things when we get into the dialogue.
Thank you, Ken. Malcolm.
Great. Paul, Ken, thanks. Everyone, look, it's delightful to be here, and it's delightful to be supporting CEDA in examining, critical issues of what are the future of our cities, and today talking about resilience. Look, I wanted to use my introductory comments to kind of maybe just broaden the discussion out a little bit. And I want to start with a delightful phrase that reminds ourselves of what is the nature of a city. And it's by a guy called Patrick Geddes, and many of you will know it. And he says something along the lines of, a city is more than the place in space. It is a journey in time. And so a city is always in change. It's in continuum. But we've all felt, one of the disruptions of generations in the last 18 months. But cities have always been disrupted. They've always been impacted. And they've always been asking the question, maybe not using the word resilient, but how do they defend, adapt, respond to kind of sustain their existence? And so I think it's important that we get a little bit of a nuance into what is this notion of impact. And so Joe Da Silva, who works with me and leads our sustainable strategy in Arup, described to me, Malcolm, she's working with the Rockefeller Foundation. She developed the, Cities Resilience Index, and I encourage you to go and have a look at that, the breadth of parameters. But Joe said, remind yourself, Malcolm, that disruption happens two ways. It can happen in a short and a narrow form. So there could be an impact in a neighborhood or in a city or in a street. And then that's most of the time. Occasionally, it happens wide and long. And that is the pandemic. And so there are nuances to these shocks and impacts that we're going to have to understand. And I think, the wide and the long come along occasionally. It's a problem when they start stacking up next to each other. A tsunami meets a pandemic, etc. But the defining characteristic possibly of where we find ourselves is the issue of speed. The way in which, because of an increased urbanization, cities by nature concentrating people make the impact of vulnerability higher, and therefore the speed and scale of impact is significantly more than it has ever been in human existence. And so how do we address that? Look, we could look at it in many ways. There is an incredible, unique alignment of factors that has happened in the last 18 months. Our digital capacity to understand the world in which we exist, to monitor it, but more importantly, to model it, and to look at a variety of scenarios that we can begin to digitally test our resilience has never existed before. So we start talking about being fit for many futures. What are the reasonable scenarios of any particular city, some shared globally, like a pandemic, some very local, the impact of a water, contamination on a reservoir? And how do we make our places fit for many futures? Then what we need to do is think about the way in which we form our cities differently. Two ways. One is we need to understand that most of the time we live our lives in the normality of our place. Occasionally they get impacted. Occasionally we need to put an overlay over the top of a city to respond to resilience and impact. Are we ready for those overlays? The second thing is we need to understand infrastructure fundamentally differently. When Bazalgette built the sewer in London, he didn't just build a pipe. They built a flood-resistant wall, enough space for an underground system, the property value associated on the northern side of the Thames. There was a kind of multiplicity of outcome. We have to start understanding how we get multiplicity of outcomes so that resilience adds to infrastructure, adds into social outcome, and we get a kind of diversity of things. So look, I look forward to, Paul, examining it with colleagues on the screen today and questions coming in from the audience. But there's some thoughts to start about, what could resilience be if we're fit for many futures?
That's great. Thank you all for the very concise summaries leading into the questions and answers. But that's actually given us an extra 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'd like to think that those questions will start flooding in. There's a couple coming in already. But to kick things off, obviously the pandemic is the focus at the moment. And it's quite interesting that in Australia we've had bushfires, floods, mice overrunning regional New South Wales, all with that overlay of a pandemic. In the natural disasters, we tend to see this reasonable amount of bipartisan approach to the well-being of people inside a natural disaster. One thing that's been pretty obvious during the pandemic approach is become quite partisan and very political. My question is, what should we be doing about that? Because I think it's not leading us to a position where we seem to be sort of moving in the right direction all of the time when there's this sort of conflict happening at a state and a federal level and even state to state.
Presumably, aside from butting our heads up against brick walls, you mean, Paul? Yeah. Look, it's a real challenge. I think, we have a situation normal with our political system, federalism, etc., which means that politicians are always going to play politics, except for in perhaps the rarest of circumstances. And I think, credit to the idea of a national cabinet, and I think a lot of what the national cabinet did, there was quite a good level of harmonisation around that in the earlier months, which hasn't always been replicated in the future. But I think we've got to keep holding governments to account. I think keep showing governments that that business community and other interests are looking for good long-term outcomes. Are guided by the experts, the scientists, the health authorities, et cetera, when we're facing these sorts of things, so that they feel the political ground has been set as much as possible. But I also think we just got to recognise that politicians are going to be political, and that's just how it is.
And I think it's worth acknowledging that we've, for the most part, compared to other countries, had a lot of political unity, in particular in the way the pandemic response has been run. Yes, there's been nuances, and because we're very close to it, we can focus on those nuances. But, compared to the culture wars that have been happening in, other parts of the globe, it's actually been a relatively unified response, and it's been that unity which has been the substantive difference from the Australian response. And I think for many of us in these spaces, it's about how do we actually create the bipartisan space on other key issues that require long-term focus and drive the bipartisan area into the agenda, because, having things solely focused on, that can be perceived as being one side of politics actually means short-term action. It ties it very much to the term of a set of politicians, whereas, when we look at these issues, all Australians want, their homes and their families to be safer. They want to feel more comfortable in a wide range of scenarios. Positioned right, the solutions in this space, have all the opportunities to resonate broadly in that market space. However, they're all complex and they're long term. So we have to, sort of have a pathway towards them, because, being transparent, people often talk about building back better. But if you usually in the face of any crisis, there's the need to move quickly. And so you actually need to have had long-term strategy and partnership before the crisis for you to have a chance of really building back better at any scale of magnitude.
Well, I'm going to throw a little bit of a different angle on that, because I grew up in Queensland, but I've spent few decades over in the UK, and recently delighted to be back and living in my home country of Australia in Melbourne. But I was observing it from the other side, and there we were deep in the pandemic in the UK. And I do wonder whether we sometimes undervalue the creative tension that you get in the Australian system between federal and state. Looking inside it, I'm sure it felt very, questionable. Is this the smartest way to be doing it? But ask yourself the question, what's the alternative? A kind of the way in which the pandemic and other, issues were handled in the UK, it was handled at a kind of central government level. It was a cumbersome process of deployment, of acknowledgement of the issue, of speed of response, and so, there's something about resilience is beyond the pandemic, is the ability for cities to have this creative tension in play, this kind of micro and macro accountability simultaneously to what Davina outlined as there has to be a kind of a clear approach should one be exposed to these things. So, maybe the creative tension between state and federal in Australia has produced some of the outcomes that we see ourselves in today of very luckiness. Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm. As tempting as it is to sort of head down that rabbit hole of the pandemic questions, we've actually got some pretty good questions coming in online. So we'll divert away from the pandemic for the time being. And let's go to quite a simple one from Dom. Are smart cities a feasible, worthwhile goal to pursue in Australia?
Well, I might lead out on that one as well. I go to my opening comments. I think if we pre-pandemic, there was a high consensus about what we need to be doing with Australia's cities. It was pursuing that high amenity, high livability outcome. It was investing in the sort of transit infrastructure we needed to be able to, connect cities. It was, good quality, medium density and high density in the right places. It was understanding, bringing our city centres to life and investing in those, all those great things that everybody on the call would be familiar with. And then the question is, and of course, a smart technology overlay to that, which was emerging very strongly. So then the question is, is that still the right model or not? Or is there some change to that model that the pandemic has now taught us? I would say that is still the right model. Yes, there will be impacts and differences out of the pandemic. We could talk about some of those, but actually, whether we're talking about the economics of agglomeration, whether we're talking about human beings as social animals and wanting to connect and be together, whether we're talking about some of those fundamentals about, what do people value in a community? I think, yes, there will be learnings. Yes, there will be some changes, but, a lot of the playbook that we would have been pursuing as in this agenda is still the right playbook. And one of the big mistakes we could make would be, okay, well, let's stop doing a bunch of that and navel gaze for 5 years, because we know in a growth-focused country like Australia, that just catches us up real quick and creates lots and lots of problems, many of which we're still trying to solve.
Malcolm, Davina?
Yeah, why not? You look, I think, I often get asked the question about smart cities, and I have to kind of resist saying it's kind of like, do we have electricity in our cities? There isn't a choice. It's an infrastructure. It's a tool. It's a mechanism that is of our age, and we have the, to ask the slightly more fundamental questions: how do we use it, and why is it relevant? And I think smartness is about kind of, allowing us to, increasingly understand invisibles. So we can see things and we can monitor things and we can reveal things in a different way. We start to understand relationships between things. So is air quality related to transit systems, which is related to poverty? causalities that previously didn't exist. And so that's where we deploy it. But I think the rubber hits the road, in a different way in terms of smartness. What that often allows us to do is to kind of make efficient things that are repeatable. That's what digital environments do. If I can add 1 + 1 + 1 and do it through a computer at a microsecond, then I don't need to do it. That allows time to be redeployed. And I think the one thing that I think that we have to ask ourselves about a resilient city in relation to smart is, have we got the right diversity? We've come from a kind of a real-time supply chain where my salmon could come from Scotland via an A380 into Sydney if you wanted it, or my granite could come from somewhere else. We now understand that supply chains are very different. And so the notion of making, instead of us just being in this kind of clever knowledge type of economy, making is going to be localized. And therefore, smart is going to be about supply chains, how we make things, how we are efficient on the resources that we use. And I think that's the next generation, Ken, that I hope we're kind of driving into, build on that momentum that we have, and then take it into this new world of how do we secure and make ourselves resilient using smart technologies and systems.
And I think, look, I totally agree. Obviously, the digitisation of cities will occur. I think there's a really interesting discussion, and there's a group called the Sustainable Digitisation Project who are publishing at the moment on what's this balance between the opportunities that we receive from doing the data monitoring, like what Malcolm's talking about, and what we give up in privacy terms. And so I think it's really sensible and coherent to have these plans as part of a long-term future of where we want to go and examine the consequences in a material way. But, at the first tier, one of the things that we've learned out of the last year is people want even more opportunities to work everywhere, at a range, and that often helps push some of the the city of villages, a more diversity rather than the mega city, where some of those opportunities for scale that we've been talking about in urban planning circles for a long time. Actually, the one thing that COVID's done is kick the fourth industrial revolution into technology and make it incredibly clear that for task-related work, wherever your laptop is probably the best place for that. But really fundamentally and importantly, the kind of collaboration and innovation environments that are best stimulated in other ways, well, there is still absolutely a place for that traditional engagement. So I think, we don't want to talk about, smart buildings that are, less clever than my 7-year-old and worship at their altar. But I think really looking at, the why behind some of these questions and using that for where we want to go is the opportunity.
Thanks, Davina. It was actually pointed out to me in a meeting in Sydney a couple of weeks ago that we shouldn't be saying smart cities. It's about smart places. That it's not just in the cities where the smarts are valuable. So now I've got a question from Jason. Designing the future of tomorrow today needs a paradigm shift. Why are we not seeing this shift happen through the governance arrangements to achieve a new way of doing things, more integration?
I'll start. Because it's hard. Let's just be really transparent. It is far harder. The future is often oversold and underimagined. And many people are afraid of getting it wrong. And there's been, spectacular examples if we look through history of what Bill Gates said about the largest computer that anyone would ever need. It's easy to get these things wrong. So it's safer to stay in the current paradigm. But, to be clear, when we're designing cities of tomorrow, currently we're using temperature data from 30 years ago to design our cities of today and tomorrow. There needs to be a fundamental phase shift, because when we don't do that homework, we then need to rebuild things sometimes multiple times because we're looking at yesterday's paradigms. So this is enormously complex, but it is fundamentally important. And so I absolutely take that question and think we really need to lean into it, and we need to make it unacceptable to design for the cities of today because they're not imagining and understanding the challenges of tomorrow. And we have to have really concentrated work streams, do the research and then use the governance frameworks to drive them all the way through, and actually having national plans in that area that are appropriately state accessed, at least agreeing on the fundamentals, is, you know, phenomenally important.
Davina, I think there's something really interesting to kind of unpack in that thing of who leads what. I think we'd like to think that government and governance leads, but in that, going back to my notion of speed in resilience, I think the way in which things change, you know, governance and government is often kind of playing catch up. And you also have to kind of relate that back, because I think, you know, we haven't, I think, spoken enough or maybe drawn out enough the role of our economic structures that enable us to be resilient, you know, and I think the role of private capital in the making of a city relative to the role of kind of state capital. I can, you know, you can draw examples from around the world. Different examples mean that they're different things. In the Australian cities, private capital plays a fundamental structural role, almost like no other places in the world. And therefore, there is a lead inside that space. And so in one way, we have to kind of look at the way in which we use capital to make our cities in a different way. But I cannot overemphasize, you know, the gravity that we place at Arup on research and the reasonable scenarios of the future. You know, we need to deploy every tool that we have, digital, you know, research, you know, projection, that projection of a future scenario in which we make things. And we have to be creative and understand that that is a broad piece of variables, of currencies, you know, from social value all the way through to kind of economic return to risk mitigation. And we need to be able to kind of produce, you know, to look over that horizon in order to be able to see the cities that we're making in the future that we want to make. Is it a paradigm shift? I go back to my city as a journey in time. It's a continuum, and there might be increased and decreased levels of change, but I think it's the continuum. I worry sometimes when we say there is a paradigm shift, because it kind of says, you know, the king is dead, long live the king. I don't think it always happens like that. Ken, maybe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, well, two perspectives. So one is, you know, I think one of the things which, you know, will increasingly be very different here is data and access to data and the power of that. And, you know, I think Davina's quite right to, and the questioner is quite right to sort of flag, you know, we've got a lot of governance, which is really 19th century, you know, governance here, which you know tries to overlay cities, which is just completely different. The role of capital, as Malcolm's just been talking about. So data will be a really critical way of sort of you know moving through that. I think another thing that we think has been very important in recent years, which is trying to address some of the challenges in the question, is city deals, where borrowing a UK type of approach. Yes, in the UK it was set up for different reasons than what really the Australian situation needs, but part of the Australian situation is actually to work out how we align three levels of government around a future agenda for a city or a city region or an urban area. And we've had a suite of city deals. Some have been more powerful and than others, and some of them been pretty much just pre-election announcements, to be honest. But there is a lot of opportunity for that mechanism to evolve, informed by technology, also informed by different ambition, a resilience ambition. Not any of these city deals actually have any sort of link to an emissions framework and emissions targets, and it could easily be done. And once you start looking, from a spatial perspective at quite a broader level, it's quite exciting opportunities can open up. So that is something that I think that we've been able to crack as an opportunity. It's been positive. Much more to realise there, so I wouldn't like to see that edge away.
Okay, thank you all for that. As we know that urbanisation is one of the global megatrends, and there's no more urbanised country in the world than Australia almost. And the question that we have here from Dr. Ricky at ACU is, our major cities and infrastructure are built along the coast of Australia, which is a historic legacy, but we have a lot of landmass. Is it feasible, sustainable, needed to have inland desert cities, maybe next to a nuclear power plant? I added that last bit, so that wasn't part of the question.
But I feel like a city's designer should jump into that, Paul. Maybe I'll tackle it this way. If you've been watching the contemporary history of Jakarta, you will see that the Indonesian government is planning to move the city. We are fortunate enough to be looking at some of those early studies. So that was not a case of, as the questioner asked, about being on the coast. Jakarta is vulnerable to any number of other things. It's on the earthquake belt, it's the volcano belt, tsunami exposure, all the things of those things. So it asks the question of where would a new city go? Let alone a capital. And so the criteria for assessing where you kind of place cities is very interesting. To kind of bring it back to the question at hand, the historic nature of the growth of the cities along the seaboard in Australia, it was about basic need. It was, where was water, where was accessibility, how could you move, all of those type of things. So, just because the landmass is there, doesn't mean it's the right place to go. We have to set out what are the criteria that we're going to evaluate, are the underlying conditions of where we inhabit. It may require us to adjust the cities on the eastern seaboard and to create new degrees of resilience. A lot of our work increasingly is asking, what does it mean for things like 1.5 meters sea level rise on Port Phillip Bay, for example? What does it mean around Brisbane and the inundation areas there on the low-lying flatlands in Moreton Bay? So to say where you're going to build new things, I think sometimes distracts from the great challenges of 80% of our cities that will exist in the future exist now. And so it's the challenge of how we often address those, rather than just asking the question of where you build the new thing. But, it's an interesting provocation. Whether or not it's a nuclear power station, maybe we could ask Mr. Gates, who's proposing a new model of nuclear. I'm sure Davina or Ken have got some thoughts.
I would have jumped in and said a renewable power station. If you're looking at any of the energy modelling reports, and I do note that Paul added that to the questioner's comments, so I do apologise. Look, one of the things I think to note is, to Malcolm's point, some of this will be existing cities. We will be seeing some of these locations move. You gave a number of examples. A lot of the sea locations are going to be uninhabitable. One of the big challenges is when the coastline becomes uninsurable, right? So when we look at the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, there's been talk about what happens when the money moves. And in all cases, the Financial Security Board globally said that their number one risk for the capital markets is that they haven't understood the financial risk of climate change. The idea that banks have, they're assuming there's a mortgage flow for 30 years, but what do you do if said house literally falls off the proverbial cliff? And so a framework's been created, the Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosures, and its focus is saying, what are the things you do on the governance side? What are the risks? What are the targets? What are the practical strategy elements that you run through your business so that you're ready for this future scenario? But the ideal aim of that is so that you understand where that sits on your balance sheet. And what we're finding is when the key driver for individual entities, which, to Malcolm's earlier point, collectively becomes a move is when some of those assets will be undefendable or uninsurable as the climate substantially changes around it. So if we're going to see moves in cities, it's probably going to be led by a number of corporate entities finding locations are uninsurable. We already have residential locations in Australia that are either uninsurable or they're uninsurable for their key risk, as in floodplains that can't get flood insurance. And so, I think that as a financial driver, to the earlier question, that's going to be delivered more out of the financial markets, the new capital markets, and that will be global drivers rather than local governance models. And I think that's where we'll start to see staging of change. And that's where we've got to look at disruption, because those won't be planned by central governments in the same way. We need to really monitor those to ensure that there's equity. And so it's not healthy for the wealthy who move to higher ground and, a real challenge for the most vulnerable within our communities.
Just quickly, I think you look at Australia's experience. We're a fast-growing population, but have really only grown 2 new cities in the last 100 years, Canberra and the Gold Coast. One of them had to have the seat of government in the middle of it to make happen. That's still not even a very big city. So I think the idea that we're going to see a mushrooming of reasonable-sized cities outside of the current locations is pretty unlikely. The other thing to say here is, what is one of the megatrends, not just urbanisation, but actually that if you look at global economics, it's the economics of cities. It's cities as attractors for talent and for business and for economic activity, and that's been the emerging megatrend with a real strength about it, and that's what's fed the urbanisation, because people want part of that action. And I think that's still here. Yes, there'll be other things which will have a pandemic impact, I'm sure. We'll be able to have some more networked urban forms with, more options for people outside of the larger Australian cities in more of a similar way that they have, say, in the US. But are our big cities going to be our winners of the future? I think they are. And if they're not, that's actually a big problem for the whole country.
The questions are flying in, and we're actually quickly running out of time, but there's a trend developing here that I'd like to explore a little bit. Ken, you said that cities are there that are good, cities that are managed well and are built well attract talent. We've seen through the pandemic this move away from the CBDs with people working from remotely, working from home. What's going to happen? Is this a long-term trend, do you think, or is it something that after a year or two we'll just revert back to where we were, the impact that it'll have on public transport and the like? How do you see this sort of playing out in the medium to long term?
I'll jump into that very quickly. So we've been tracking occupancy in CBDs. What we've seen is outside of Sydney and Melbourne, actually we've jumped back to a reasonably strong level of occupancy relatively quickly. Melbourne has much more to roll out. Sydney is still rolling out. We've seen this other dynamic where it's actually pretty busy on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but not very busy at all on Monday and Fridays. There will clearly be more flexibility into the future. I think everybody expects that flexibility will be a bigger part of the future, that workplaces will need to adapt because they will be crucibles of connectivity and focus more on that requirement. But some of that impact won't be known until this vaccine rollout has gone through, and then we'll have assuming the COVID environment stays under control, we'll sort of know what that vaccinated population normal feels like. Again, if I were to sort of speculate on what does that feel like, well, CBDs have still got an enormously powerful role to play in our economic environment and in a lot of people's work lives. But there's going to be a spectrum of work styles and business operations off that, and a broader spectrum perhaps than what we saw pre-pandemic.
And I'd say there's two sides of that. There's a piece of that we really have to embrace. Urban planning has been talking for many years about how do we distribute so it's not just about one megacity, and how do we distribute the load of people so it's better for public transport and better for broader infrastructure. So there's a real upside in that. I think on some of the cities and the property context, for a long time, we've spoken about experiential retail. So if someone can have a package delivered to their door, why do they want to come? And it's that's human experience, the community experience, that social experience. And so, we used to use the framework clicks and bricks in retail, so that it's the combination of an online response and a face-to-face. I think we're going to see a real emergence of cities, of offices, experiential. I had my own landlord come and offer to drop me off a coffee in my Keep cup on a Friday because they were so happy to see me. And, that gave me a very warm smile at about 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. So I think the different ways that we wrap the community response and the why people are coming in, whilst appropriately recognising for task-based work that can be done more remotely. And that is a great thing for our cities, our infrastructure, our environmental footprint when done well.
Davina, I'll just add a quick tag to that, Paul, so we can get on to some other questions. I think it is changing. I think Ken nicely kind of outlined we've got this new option and how when we are in knowledge-based industries, the city historically has been the kind of space of knowledge transaction. That's what I think is changing. As we increasingly see the cities as knowledge and creative interaction, that creative ecosystem requires two other things other than people exchanging information. It requires money and it requires making. There is a triangulation between knowledge, money, and making that I think we're going to see the renaissance, and we will see, I imagine, the repurposing of some of the office space in our CBD environments into making environments as we move into manufacturing 4.0, the clean technologies that we are able to do. You'll be able to kind of be making a titanium hip joint above a lawyer's office.
Okay, and I think this question from Elliot might take us through to the conclusion. We largely know what we have to do to become more resilient, but it costs more, and convincing government, regulators, and those to invest in those benefits takes time that we don't have. How do we resolve this?
Well, I think one of the things to note is just how correct this point is. So not only do we intuitively know this, we have studies that tell us this. We have Productivity Commission reports from 2015 that says every dollar we spend on disaster avoidance actually leads to $7 reduction in need for remedial work. So there's a 7-to-1 benefit here. I think one of the challenges that we used to have in the population used to be the community response, won't happen here, mate. The idea that before 2020, we actually felt pretty invulnerable. And so one of the discussions that we used to struggle, particularly in the environmental movement, was to explain vulnerability, that this could happen to you, this could happen here. I think that there's been a fundamental shift in the community response and the community expectation of government. And, the emperor has no clothes. Certain governments have been shown to not have long-term plans for issues that are absolutely critical for their citizens. So I think it's the role of groups like CEDA, like the Green Building Council, the Property Council, leaders like Arup, to actually re-prosecute this case in a new environment with a new degree of community expectation backed by a very strong new sense of vulnerability, and to hammer home the point that we need to do the work now, otherwise we can't have a safer future for our citizens, and we need to back our researchers. One of the amazing things that came out of the pandemic and continues to come out of the pandemic is those who listen to the research and do good policy based on it prosper. Those who follow other pathways, unfortunately, their citizens suffer enormous consequences. And I don't think we've talked about that in academic circles. We've talked about that in certain progressive industry circles. I don't think that's been on global display in a context the way it has over the last year. And, you can see the Biden government, they're now noting that where they're aligned with community satisfaction, they're going to go hard on the difficult issues in a way that previously their political party hadn't been willing to pursue, and that they would ignore hyper-partisanship if it wasn't where the community needed to be. So I think there's some interesting new models coming out of what is a fundamental shift in community expectation.
Davina, as the architect, I'm going to talk about economics. So I'm sure CEDA will excuse me for being kind of so indulgent. But in one of the team I led in London was integrated city planning, where we had economists next to the spatial designers. And so we saw the interrelationship of that narrative. The question was about, how do we, we know what's needed, how do we make it happen? I guess I saw a structural shift when I started to see what was the Green Book analysis, the Treasury in the UK, the way in which they assess the business case for investment, become Green Book Plus. The government realised that there needed to be a levelling up of social equity across the UK. There was certainly a component of that, of kind of, as everyone says, build back better. I'm not sure whether Boris and his team invented it, but they certainly claim it, but they do that to most things. But what the fundamental question was, they aimed at Treasury. They aimed at the economic root of the way in which particularly government money was done. And the Green Book Plus required a demonstration of what Davina was just saying, of kind of social value outcome beyond just kind of technical performance or a kind of a de-risking of thing. So I think, if we're going to see resilience kick in, we're going to see the kind of the shift in the deep models that we use for the likes of Treasury and government funding to demonstrate these broader outcomes, and particularly the social value outcomes.
And just I know we're going to close in a sec. I think that economic point is very relevant for Australia. So productivity pre-crisis was very low. We've got this amazing recovery happening, but that the stimulus won't last, and we're going to need to be on our own, and productivity is going to drive that. And I think the thing for this conversation is that there is a productivity of place, and in one of the most highly urbanised countries in the world, if we get that right, learning the lessons of COVID, then that is a powerful platform for the future.
Well, thank you all for those comments and addressing the questions that came from the audience. That we have a poll question here, which was, what should be the top priority for governments when planning resilient cities? And it's interesting results. So the results are community and wellbeing, 45.4%, environmental sustainability, 45.5%, and COVID-19 and biohazard resilience, 9.1%. Physical security, a donut, 0. So I think it's very heartening, actually, that we're focusing on things other than COVID-19 for what we think are the priorities that the government should be focusing on. And in my closing comments before I pass over to Joe, I think that we probably only just scratched the surface of this topic today. One of the things that stood out for me was the comment on supply chain. And I think that if there's one thing that was almost surprising was the significance of the supply chain impact. Shortly into COVID-19, I think 95% of the global air fleet were offline. And that put a significant impact on air freight, as we saw with the freight logistic companies enforcing their force majeure contracts that they had. And further on down the track now, we have this issue with sea freight, not helped by a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal, but then that comes back to the whole topic of resilience, doesn't it? That's for the impact that had. But look, it's been a fascinating discussion with you all, and I appreciate the input that you've given and addressing the questions so candidly. And Joe, now I shall pass back to you so that we can conclude at 2 p.m.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, everyone, and particularly our participants, so Davina, Ken, Malcolm, for sharing your insights and your expertise on this important topic. For me, smart places, not smart cities, really stands out. But Paul, as you say, there is certainly a whole lot to unpack in this space. So thank you all for sharing your fantastic insights today. And a particular thanks again to our live stream sponsor, Arup, and particularly to Paul. Your ongoing support allows CEDA to continue to lead discussion around these really important issues that matter for Australia. For those online, you can continue adding your questions to Pigeonhole for the next 15 minutes if you like, if you've got further questions you'd like to ask. CEDA will post selected responses in the post-event email, which will also include a link to the recording of today's discussion. And please do stay up to date with CEDA's program by visiting our website. We have some great events coming up, including our State of the Nation conference in Canberra on the 23rd of June. So do get online and check that out. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today, for the great conversation, the fantastic questions, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.